The Chief Investment Officer of the California Public Employees Retirement System, CalPERS, held a similar position in China while working for the State Administration of Foreign Exchange.
Anyone who holds such a post in the State Administration of Foreign Exchange has to be competent ideologically.
CalPERS is funding Chinese military contractors and human rights abusers. How big is China's footprint in the U.S. capital markets?
The number of companies that are in our capital markets today that are Chinese, we find that some 600 and over 650 such enterprises are there.
You're telling me they don't know about the Uyghurs? They do not know about the enslavement of the Chinese people? Sure they know. And they don't care.
Besides national security concerns and human rights abuses, the real danger associated with investment in China is fraud.
Almost all Chinese companies have two sets of accounting records. One is for internal use, the other is for the tax bureau.
Welcome to Zooming In, I'm Simone Gao. If you ask any American whether hundreds of billions of US tax dollars, including federal employee pension funds, should go into Chinese companies that pose national security threat to the US, are human rights abusers, and engage in fraudulent practices, they would say, no, of course not. But that's exactly what's been going on for years. And the appalling fact is that practice is very hard to stop, because Wall Street is making tons of money from it. Everyone else is doing it. There seems to be no other viable alternatives, and it might be too late to decouple now. But is it really so? What's the true face of these investments? Can they bring financial securities to Americans, or will they make the country more vulnerable? Is now the last chance to change it? We'll explore these questions in this episode of Zooming In.
In a person's life, if there's an opportunity to work for the motherland, this responsibility and honor is unmatched by anything. His name is Ben Meng. He's the Chief Investment Officer of the California Public Employees Retirement System, CalPERS. CalPERS is one of the country's largest pension funds that manages more than $350 billion for public employees either retired from or currently working for most of the state and local public agencies in California. When the People's Daily quoted Mr. Meng's pledged allegiance to his motherland, he was referring to the People's Republic of China. Meng was born and raised in China and came to the U.S. to study at the University of California, Davis, in 1995. Prior to his position at CalPERS, Meng served as the Deputy CIO at the State Administration of Foreign Exchange of China, SAFE, for 3 years. SAFE is a Chinese administrative agency under the State Council tasked with drafting rules and regulations governing foreign exchange market activities and managing the state's foreign exchange reserves. These reserves, held by the People's Bank of China, stood at $3.01 trillion at the end of December 2016, tightly controlled by the regime. China's foreign reserve system is one of the key institutions for the world's second-largest economy.
In order to work in such an organization, he had to be eligible ideologically and professionally. The former means being loyal to the CCP, while the latter means meeting professional standards. For the CCP, ideological requirements are more important, since many core secrets are involved in working in such organizations.
Mr. Meng does have a prestigious background. Before he first joined CalPERS in 2008, he worked at Barclays as a senior portfolio manager, at Lehman Brothers Holdings as a risk officer, and he was also a fixed-income trader at Morgan Stanley. Meng's experience in the United States qualified him to be a candidate for the Chinese government's prestigious headhunting program, Thousand Talents Plan, TTP. The TTP recruits and hires professionals who hold high-level positions, mainly in the United States, but also throughout the Western world. Individuals recruited by the TTP, according to an FBI report, have been experts or scholars in prestigious universities or research institutes, senior managerial professionals in internationally known financial institutions, or entrepreneurs holding IP rights. Once recruited by the TTP, they're required to work at least 6 months per year in China. The TTP, according to the same FBI report, is a program that allows China to gain access to and benefit from advanced technology from the United States and to severely impact the U.S. economy. Meng was officially hired by SAFE through the 1,000 Talents Plan in November 2015.
Experts recruited by the 1,000 Talents Plan are required to work in China for a certain period. The CCP authorities try every means to butter them up. For example, by helping them start their own business in China or by granting them corporate shares. The CCP also encourages them to steal intellectual property from foreign companies or research institutions. This, in fact, constitutes a criminal act. For example, Tesla reportedly sued its ex-staff for taking more than 100,000 documents and forwarding them to its Chinese competitor, XPeng Motors. Such cases are abundant in China. Out of consideration for their business and market in China, a host of affected companies are reluctant to make their stories public. There are other cases of plagiarism not yet exposed.
Meng worked at SAFE for 3 years before he returned to California. According to a Bloomberg report, Meng said it was a relatively easy decision for him to move back to the U.S., since he felt like a visitor when he worked in China. Based on the TTP requirement, Meng would no longer be officially associated with TTP once he moved back to the U.S.
CalPERS declined our request to interview Ban Meng and the company's board. Although it's unlikely that Meng is still officially involved with the TTP, his China experience gives him leverage at his current post as the Chief Investment Officer of CalPERS. China, after all, is the hotspot to invest in nowadays. How did it happen and what does it mean? Stay tuned for part 2 of this report.
The days that investors can earn 7% in U.S. bonds are long gone. In a decade-long low-rate environment, from university endowments to government pension funds, institutional investors have been challenged to achieve decent returns through a large allocation to the U.S. bond markets. This investment community sought after similar approaches to deal with the changing landscape. It unanimously increased riskier asset class investments, such as emerging markets and private equity. This demand increase for riskier assets induced many beneficiaries. China, in particular, attracts attention. The sheer size of its economy, the rosy prospect for its future growth, especially against the memory of the 2008 financial crisis, when China shined as the only bright spot in the world economic landscape, all make China a perfect candidate for an investment community desperately seeking the next chapter for growth. But this China fever does come with a price. Based on its 2017 and 2018 annual investment report, CalPERS invested in more than 100 Chinese companies. Among them are companies related to China's military, cyber warfare, human rights abuses, and defense industries. Some of them have been cited for unethical business practices outside China. China Communication Construction Company, one of the largest contractors of China's One Belt, One Road initiative, military island builder in the South China Sea, offender of corruption, labor abuse, and fraudulent bidding practices. China Aerospace International Holding Ltd., China's largest space contractor. China Unicom, the reason North Korea's internet exists. Aviation Industry Corporation of China, aircraft and drone builder for the People's Liberation Army, frequently sanctioned by the U.S. government. Hikvision and Dahua, the world's largest video surveillance system provider whose technology is widely used in surveilling Chinese citizens. Both are on the entity list of the U.S. Department of Commerce.
CalPERS governance guidance does command the company to operate in support of universal human rights. It also requires the company to do businesses with parties that enjoy political freedom and freedom of speech, which a number of the Chinese companies CalPERS invested in clearly violate. Zooming in asked CalPERS if these investments jeopardize the company's fiduciary responsibilities to their clients. CalPERS did not give us an answer. CalPERS China investment is not an exception among institutional investors, but rather a common practice. In fact, billions of dollars from U.S. pension funds and college endowments have channeled into Chinese technology companies in search of investment returns.
After the Chinese Communist regime's bloody crackdown of the 1989 Tiananmen pro-democracy movement, the American government put various sanctions on China. Those sanctions were quickly relaxed as the Bush, Clinton, and Obama administrations pursued a policy of engagement with China. American technology and capital flow to China facilitated China's technological rise. Particularly in the past 5 years, China has made great advancements in artificial intelligence, big data, drone technology, etc. U.S. pension funds and endowments have been a big financial proponent of that development. According to a Bloomberg report, the Delaware Public Employees Retirement System and the State of Michigan Retirement System have been funding Shenzhen DJI Technology Corporation, the world's leading drone maker whose products are banned by the U.S. Army. SenseTime, based in China, is considered the world's most valuable AI startup. It has raised money from venture firms, including those backed by CalPERS, the Washington State Investment Board, and the Teacher Retirement System of Texas. ByteDance Ltd., a leading developer of AI apps headquartered in Beijing, has benefited from the backing of funds raised from the New York State Teachers Retirement System, the Oregon Public Employees Retirement System, and the Minnesota State Board of Investment. These investments paid off. The Washington State Investment Board posted an internal rate of return of 24% from its investment in the Warburg Pincus China Fund between early 2017 and 2018. By comparison, the fund's private equity portfolio returned 15.3% in 2018. In fact, more than 90,000 of U.S. foundations and endowment have some exposure to China that range from millions to billions of dollars in 2018 alone.
With the prospect of high investment returns, China looms especially large for institutional investors in the emerging markets. It represents an uncomfortably outsized stake in the U.S. pension funds and endowments, and an overpowering influence. Stay tuned for part 3 of this report.
An MSCI decision only further excited this dynamic. On June 20th, 2017, the Morgan Stanley Capital International Index, MSCI, announced that it will include China A shares in the MSCI Emerging Markets Index starting in June 2018. Next, it will be including those shares in its All-Country World Index and China Index. The company also announced that it will increase the weight of China A shares in the MSCI indexes by increasing the inclusion factor from its initial level of 5% to 20% in 3 steps. This is the 4th time China's A shares have applied for membership, after the first 3 were rejected. 234 A shares were included in the MSCI index system. A shares are stocks of Chinese companies incorporated on the mainland, quoted in renminbi and listed in Shanghai and Shenzhen.
When you look at the indexes, like the MSCI Emerging Market Index, it's tracked by $2 trillion of funds under management. It's mimicked by 14 trillion more. Every time they add a Chinese company, and they're doubling the number in the next 12 months, as much as $14–16 trillion automatically buy those stocks.
That was Roger Robinson at the newly formed Committee on the Present Danger of China. He was Senior Director of International Economic Affairs at the National Security Council during the Reagan administration and later served as chairman of the Congressional U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. He pointed out that it was difficult for funds to change course on their China investments, and the biggest boost from the American federal pension funds to Chinese tech firms is yet to come.
The Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, FRTIB, manages nearly $600 billion in U.S. federal employees' retirement funds, making it one of the world's largest of its kind. Its Thrift Savings Plan, TSP, is the federal government equivalent of a 401k. Any federal employee who has a retirement fund through his or her job is a member of the TSP. One of the most important investment components of the TSP is an international fund known as the I Fund. In 2017, the FRTIB board voted to shift the fund index from the MSCI EAFE Europe, Australasia, Far East Index to the MSCI All-Country World EX-US Investable Market Index, which is poised to include China A-shares. The index also includes Russian companies. Set to take effect next year, the transition will force the FRTIB to invest about $3.3 billion of federal employee savings in state-owned and state-directed firms in China. Under the current system, federal employees have little control over where their pension money is invested. Federal retirees' dollars flow freely to companies such as Hikvision, which is under U.S. Commerce Department sanctions because of its human rights abuses. Jim Banks, a U.S. congressman from Indiana, introduces H.R. 2903, the Blocking Investment in Our Adversaries Act, with the intention of reversing the controversial decision by the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board in 2017.
It seems ironic that federal employees' funds would be used to support our adversaries.
Congressman Banks' bill is still under review in the House Committee on Oversight and Reform.
Can you give me an estimate of the Chinese penetration into the U.S. capital market?
I saw one estimate by a group that looks at these matters that was a better thing. I mean, it's very hard to determine. It's a very hard number to get because, particularly for the bonds, because dollar-denominated bonds, our currency, are issued in Frankfurt, Hong Kong, Singapore, but they end up in the United States because American investment banks buy them overseas and bring them in via the secondary market. So it gets very complex. Believe me, I've tried. But I've seen a number of 1.9 trillion from the stock, the equity or stock side alone, and as much as another trillion in bonds. Now, we spend $700 billion a year on defense. Imagine how that stacks up to $3 trillion.
Yes, and China's entire foreign reserve is $3 trillion. And the gross investment for the Belt and Road Initiative is $600 billion.
How do they seemingly have an unlimited checkbook for nation capture in the region, Southeast Asia and so forth, or continent capture in the case of Africa, or region capture in the parts of South Latin America? How do they have the unlimited money, so it seems, to become a near competitor with the United States militarily?
It's ironic. There's no alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. The U.S. cannot afford a Belt and Road Initiative. China can. But where does China get its money?
I think we've talked about more than a hint of where they're getting the money. Again, people say, well, you know, if the U.S. even enforces existing regulations and securities laws, oh, you better watch out. China will go elsewhere. They'll go to London. They'll go to Frankfurt. They'll go to Singapore. They'll go to Hong Kong. And we'll be the ones that have shot ourselves in the foot. Our markets won't be as competitive anymore. We're going to lose all this business gratuitously to others. There are no others we have the bulk of the investable capital in the world today. They would use up a Frankfurt or a London or a Singapore in months, not years. They don't have the depth, they don't have the liquidity to handle the excruciating sums, the voracious dollar appetite of China. So just remember, there is nowhere else to go.
In July 2019, Senators Marco Rubio and Jeanne Shaheen wrote to the board of FRTIB to urge it to reverse its decision to adopt the all-country index. The result? Senator Rubio's office told Zooming In that they did not receive a response to their questions. They did receive a reply from the chairman of FRTIB saying they would consider his suggestion. On October 24, 2019, right before the FRTIB board met again, Rubio sent a second letter urging the board to reverse its decision to track the MSCI All-Country Index. The FRTIB board met on October 29th. When Zooming In called FRTIB on the day of the meeting, the company representative said they could not comment on the board meeting, but the company is scheduled to switch to the MSCI All-Country Index sometime in 2020.
So the TSP board remained their position. They said the 10 largest U.S. companies' 401k plans all invest in emerging markets, as do the 10 largest federal contractor plans and many more. So they are entitled to do the same. What do you make of it?
You can see the very narrow view of the what I call the Thrift Savings Plan Board, which is more officially known as the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board. They're looking at return on investment. They're looking at the fact that everybody does it. They're looking at their fiduciary duty with this very narrow mindset. Well, what about material risk? That's a market condition. That's not some outside complaint like socially responsible investing, for example. It's not a preference, it's a reality. So they're prepared to overlook this kind of thing. And I think that they have missed fundamentals in this decision. It's a wrong-headed decision, and I don't believe it will stand.
There are three major concerns regarding investments in Chinese companies: national security concerns, human rights concerns, and concerns about non-transparency and fraud. While the first two categories undermine America's national interests and American values, the third category poses a direct threat to American taxpayers' financial security. And the longer we wait, the less likely any substantial changes could be made. How is this so? Stay tuned for the next episode in this special series. Thanks for watching. See you next time.